same page and have a really crystal clear definition of that. We secondly want to identify criteria for deciding whether independent practice should happen at school with us, so with some supervision of ours, or whether that should be completely independent for students at home. And certainly identify some strategies to facilitate that practice at home. We'll begin and end on time. Please stay focused. Today, you are lucky in that we are going to have lucky, I guess is a strong word, but you have the opportunity to reach out beyond Pear Deck. We're going to incorporate Padlet for some really deep conversations around independent practice from your perspectives to record some of that thinking. So please stay focused and be respectful and keep that conversation on topic as we go forward. Because you're all learners, you're all here spending part of your Tuesday afternoon with us, please assume that positive intent. We're all coming here trying to learn how to do better by the people that we serve, whether that's students or teachers or both of those groups. We're here for those reasons to support each other. Please continue to use the chat feature for any questions and responses, and we'll pause at points throughout to attend to anything that we need to. And please mute the microphone when you're not speaking, as you are here at the moment. So to take that chat protocol and the housekeeping a little bit further, please share those questions and ideas. Normally in face-to-face sessions, it's whether we're in class with kids or we're in a PL room with presenters, those back channel sidebar conversations are frowned upon. We welcome them here. That's how we get a good pulse on what you're thinking about, what you want to know about, what you're curious about. So please share those ideas with us here in the chat. We'll track those questions that you have and respond to them when we can at logical points throughout. We'll have a Q&A session here near the end, and if we can't get to you inside the session here, we'll definitely follow up and talk with you a little bit later on. We do want to let you know right up front, though, that the chat will be saved to help us facilitate that, to let us know if we've missed something so we can go back through it. And as well as you all bring some thinking to the table and additional resources and ideas, we want to make sure that everyone that's here and everyone that registered but was not able to be here today has access to some of that great thinking. So we're going to call some of that chat for the great ideas and resources that you might bring up here as well. Let's get started with our warm-up and our first Pear Deck prompt of the day. What are some criteria you use to decide whether students are ready to continue practicing a skill on their own? In other words, how do you know kids are ready for independent practice? Would you please drop something into Pear Deck by using the green button in the lower right-hand corner of your app, wherever you're using that, and tell us a little bit about what you're thinking there. How do you decide kids are ready for independent practice? And again, for those of you joining us but have not yet logged into Pear Deck, there may be a few of you. There are a few of you. I do know that much. The address is joinpd.com, and our address is posted up here in the top right corner. I'll blow it up for just a minute. Joinpd.com. FDSUC is our code. In just another moment or so, and we'll highlight some of the responses that are coming in. Lots of great thinking, but it's tough to pay attention to a lot of things on a screen at the same time, so you may not see your response being displayed here. That's okay. It's because, you know, we're just trying to highlight some of the representative thinking here that we see. So one way we know kids are ready for independent practice is when they begin to take the lead in modeling during a strategy. So when they're saying, hey, wait, miss or sir, I know how to do this. This is the next step. That's a pretty good cue. They're ready to start running with it. Certainly when we look at checks for understanding throughout our instruction, that's a good cue. They can tell us that they're ready to move on. When we hear clear speaking about the topic at hand, we know they're ready to move on independently. When they're sharing they understand or they're trying to peek ahead, they know they're ready. And certainly by the questions they ask and what we see them doing during some of that guided practice can also be good cues as well. So let's really dig in and clarify our terms and really get at what we mean by independent practice within the context of this session. So we know there's that traditional lesson cycle where we start their learning with a hook, we get them into new learning, and for those of us who are in the gradual release responsibility vernacular, that's the I do portion of the lesson. We've talked previous sessions about guided practice, or the we do portion. We're really focused on the independent practice, and that's the you do either together or you do alone portion of our learning, where students get a chance to apply what they know. And then, of course, there's the closure as well. So how do we define independent practice? What are the hallmarks of that? Well, first, it's got to be a goal-focused practice of the skill or application of content. We don't just turn students loose and say, hey, go try this, right? We want to see their proficiency and their efficacy with certain aspects of a skill, or sometimes how well they're able to integrate different aspects of a skill together in that practice. When we talk about independent practice, it's done with little or no direct supervision. So oftentimes we think of sprinters, and that's the picture we've back here, someone in the sprinting blocks. Yes, they have coaches on the side, but the only way to get better at being a distance runner is by running distances. The only way to get better by running short distances is by going through that sprint and having that really dedicated time to doing that and going through those workouts. So the coach is there on the side, and we can be there. The teacher is there on the side. There's really little or no direct supervision in this part of the lesson cycle. What we do have the opportunity to do, though, as some of you alluded to in your responses, is provide some feedback to affirm or adjust that thinking and performance to make sure that students recognize what they're doing well as part of their practice so they can continue to capitalize on that, but also to give them suggesting feedback to say, let's pause a minute and think about another way we might approach this in order to make this practice even better practice. So I want you to stop and think a minute with that definition of independent practice in mind. In recent times, so going back to emergency learning that appeared in the spring, and for those of you who have returned back to school already, as we've talked to you a little bit before we started formally, what does independent practice look like for your students? Please feel free to draw your response. Use any variety of colors that make sense to you. There is a text option available to you as well. Draw a little response for us. Tell us what practice has looked like. And just another moment or two to put the finishing touches on that sketch. Okay, and let's see a few of what I'm thinking here. So some of these, I'll be perfectly transparent, some of these I was able to make sense of pretty readily. Some others I might ask you to elaborate some on in chat or by unmuting yourselves if you feel so inclined to do so. So one of us says that, at least I assume this is what we're trying to say, is that we have students at home, and certainly in households with multiple students, they're all over the place on their individual devices trying to work independently. Another of us is, there's something happening here. We see access to different media, I presume, and we're thinking about graphing and thinking about different ideas and how they relate to each other, I presume. It's an interesting thought here, and if you'd like to unmute yourself and talk a little bit more, we are all happy to hear about it.
So we have a couple of our asynchronous teachers attempting to do little breakout chats and breakout room sessions. And so there's an attempt there. The teacher is able to work with some students independently while students kind of work on their own independent tasks. But we have a whole lot of learning to do still.
Okay, so we have the teacher, that's a T, and then the students, and then breakout rooms. Okay, got it. Thank you for helping to clarify. We have another colleague that's telling us a little bit about how there's some writing going on. And another colleague is telling us he's doing a very detailed drawing of what looks like a breakout group, and perhaps adding the keys to the keyboard down here as well. So thank you for all that thinking, and you're right. In all of the ways that you've shared that independent practice has looked lately, it is definitely linked to our computers. It's definitely linked to us, you know, having to work at home, of course. And so as we think about where students are, whether it's for the next few weeks at home or whether it's for the next semester at home, depending on what decisions your states and local governments have made, we need to think about how to make that practice meaningful as students come back to us here in the fall. And that's the guts of this session here. So just as we always do, we want to remind you that this year more than ever, your professional judgment is going to be put to the test. There are going to be cases where independent practice is appropriate. You know, one model of independent practice is appropriate at times, and in some cases we might want to provide students a little more supervision, a little more intense feedback. And you're going to know that from your kids better than we are. You can read all the books in the world, you can attend all the webinars or lectures, but you're going to end up having that, just as you do it in any other school year, you're going to know your kids and what they need better than anyone else will. So it's going to come back down to the professional instinct, the professional judgment to really help you guide your students to learning outcomes that we have for them. That said, as we think about independent practice and going back to the good match and better match analogies that and discussion that we've had about the other parts of the learning cycle, we have some thinking we want to share with you here as well. So certainly we know independent practice is a good match for doing things in person. We know it's a good match for sometimes doing things synchronously, because that's the way we were doing it 5 months ago, or 6 months ago, as the case may be. We know that we want independent practice to occur in the classroom when we're less confident students are ready to move on, or we might need some more evidence that they are ready to do things at home. So for example, we might have them do some writing here in the classroom when they're looking at an extended piece, an essay, pardon me, or something of the sort. And we might want them, we might have a looser hand, so to speak. We might be watching them from afar, but still keeping a lookout and giving some feedback and doing some conferencing with kids while they're present with us. They might be engaging in, so perhaps we did some reteaching and we wanted them to practice those exercises around a specific math concept again. But we want them to do that under a little more watchful eye this time. So we might schedule some independent practice to happen while they are with us. In the virtual setting, that could look like us dropping in on, so Pear Deck has some mathematics, so you can input numbers as an answer, which is something we haven't explored here yet because we haven't done a lot of math in our conversations about pedagogy. But certainly we can have students engaged in Pear Deck, or sorry, Google or other platforms where they're showing us some of their math competencies as well. And of course, we could ask them to engage in some review of previous learning as part of the independent practice. Generally speaking though, independent practice is a better match for when they're not with us, right? So if we know we only have those 20, 30 minutes a day of synchronous learning time, it's not always the best use of that time to spend that, you know, staring at kids silently and trying to figure out what they're working on, where we can better use that time to instead give some feedback or some more direct instruction or facilitate some peer-to-peer conversations between our kids. So when we feel that our kids are ready for independent practice and they're less likely to need support from us, we want to make sure we schedule that independent practice to happen outside of that synchronous time. So again, those examples are intentionally carried over. If they're ready to continue writing that extended essay, let them go do that at home. And we can give some peer feedback and engage in some peer feedback or some teacher to student feedback during our synchronous sessions. If they need additional practice, our synchronous session is probably the space where we're going to do the reteaching, but we send them off on their own for that independent practice and that additional practice exercises. And same if we're asking them to review some previous learning here as well. So what are, as we have you in various contexts here, in various points of readiness to go back to school, I want to reframe this question a little bit. What do we see as some benefits to facilitating independent practice at school or in a synchronous session? And what are some benefits to facilitating independent practice at home or asynchronously? So please feel free to drop some thinking in Pear Duck, and we will see what you think there. A lot of you have attended to the first part of that question about the benefits of practicing in school. We'll give you another few seconds to look at the second question. What are some benefits of having students practice at home? Let's check in with some of that thinking that we're sharing. So certainly when students are with us, we're able to have more clearly check in on what they've done. We're able to give immediate more feedback. Asynchronously requires more independence from our kids, right? To be able to even say that I'm ready to try or I can try this. Of course, as our colleague points out here, we want to be able to still give feedback on that practice. It's just not as fast as we might be able to. We certainly see that no matter where it is, that students have the benefit of practicing skills learned, and that's important. And certainly at school, we can monitor what our students are doing as well and provide feedback. At school, again, we have that formative assessment, and at home, parents have the opportunity to help and understand the abilities of our children. And that's an important point to bring up. Sometimes when we assign independent practice to happen at home, we know that it's not necessarily truly independent. So that's a chance to have engage in some dialogue with our parents about, appropriate ways to help our students and engage in some coaching with them about how to best navigate that practice and support those students without necessarily taking over the learning for them and depriving our students of those opportunities. So thank you for bringing that point forward. And that's definitely something we all need to be thinking about even while you students are in school with us and when they return to school with us. Okay, so as I mentioned at the top of the session here, we're going to be doing a little bit different things today by delving into Padlet to get some students, look at what students say about independent practice and what they see as most valuable for it. And so we're going to be working with a short excerpt from Fires in the Bathroom. And what our author did here, and part of her name is obscured by some of the Zoom chat features, but you can all see it. I simply cannot drag around what I'm trying to drag around here at the moment. But what our author did here is she visited several classrooms around the country and several schools around the country and convened focus groups for students. And she focused on both high schools and middle schools and really engaged in some surveys about their experiences at school, what was going well for them and what hadn't been going well for them. And so what's represented in the excerpt we're about to preview here in just a moment is a sampling of responses of what kids had to say about homework in this case, although that's often synonymous with independent practice. And so we think that's an important voice to hear. And of course, these aren't your kids that we're hearing from, but it is a fairly representative sample of students from both the coast and the heartland. So that's something to keep in mind. And one thing that might be helpful as we go forward is to think about how we might engage in similar dialogues with our own students and our own school environments to see what they're thinking about as well. I think that's one thing that's come out loud and clear throughout this just journey together is how much we need to bring our students and our families into some of the conversations we're having about what school looks like. And homework is certainly another avenue for that. At any rate, what we'll ask you to do here in just a moment, and I will paste the link in the chat here, is we're going to go to Padlet and have a little bit of a synchronous conversation around some excerpts from the text. So let me dump in the chat here with you, and I will paste a link to that Padlet. Maybe. Once Zoom wants to cooperate, there we go. All right. And once you have a chance to click on that Padlet, I will join you over there in just a moment and talk to you a little bit about how we're going to structure some of the conversation we'll have here.
And guys, as you're navigating over and we're thinking about ourselves as classroom teachers or the classroom teachers that we support, it's really going to be important for us to think about what does this feel like to us, because we have a Zoom going on. We've asked you to open up Pear Deck so you can give responses, and now we've asked you to open up Padlet. So just thinking about how do we support our teachers and ourselves as well as our kids in navigating through the technology that really helps to make it engaging, so that that technology is a tool for the engagement and doesn't become the challenge. It's a secondary objective of the day.
Right. And to be perfectly transparent, as we looked at our registration list for today, we saw that we have many returners, right, that are familiar with Pear Deck. And so one of our assumptions that we made is that if you're a returner, you're probably fairly familiar with Pear Deck. And so adding another wrinkle in for you might not have been as heavy of a lift, but it certainly might not be something I do on the first day with students back, is expose them to several different apps. I might want to live and breathe in one app and have them explore that a little bit. So something to keep in mind. So as you join us here in Padlet, I want to give you a quick tour of what you have in front of you. On the left-hand side is a PDF. You can click on it and enlarge that, and you'll have a short one-page excerpt. That is, as we said, a representative sample of what students had to say about independent practice. You see then there are three columns, question 1, question 2, question 3. What surprised you about what students said? What was not surprising about what students said? And what thoughts and feelings are bubbling up for you around your own practice? I'm going to ask you to go ahead and read that excerpt. It's brief, just the front of one page for you to take a look at, and take a few moments to respond to questions 1 and 2. And you will do that by clicking in where it says add a comment, saying, I was surprised by, if you can spell surprise correctly, and just tapping enter, and it will automatically capture your thinking there once you hit enter. Please go ahead and read that over, drop some thinking to both questions 1 and 2, and we'll come to question 3 here in just a moment. And as if you have any difficulties getting to Padlet or accessing it, please let us know, and we're happy to work with you and coach you through that. I am still here. Your connection has not dropped. I just want to let you know that. So take some time to read and go ahead and respond to questions 1 and 2. We're seeing some responses trickle in already, so please feel free to respond to them in any order that you're able to. And we don't need a very long response, just something, 1 or 2 things that surprised you, or 1 or 2 things that did not surprise you. One of our colleagues has gone over to question 3 as well. Feel free to jump in over there and drop some thinking there, and we'll adjust to you a little bit here as we think about our processing. Go ahead and drop some thinking there, and we'll make it work. Okay. I'll give you another moment or so to go ahead and tell us what you were surprised by or what you were not surprised by. We have some shy participants here today. That's okay. We'll work we'll work with that. Okay, we asked you to think about questions 1 and 2. Some of you I know went over to question 3 here as well. So we'll give you another moment to respond to all of those before we go forward and think about that. So if you've been holding back your response for question number 3, we know that some colleagues have gone ahead and already done that. Go ahead and put some thinking there, and we'll process all 3 of them at once. So for those, for whoever the anonymous contributor was that was wondering about gauging triviality or not, please feel free to repeat that comment there, and we will move forward with all that. Thank you for adding that back in. Okay, so taking a look at the dialogue that's happened here, and again, we do have a few shy participants, but we're hoping we can rope them in with this next portion. And this is another key thing to illustrate about some dialogues where we may have some shy participants even in our classrooms, right? So it's finding different ways for them to engage. So here's what we'll ask you to do next. We have 3 different conversations going on with question 1, question 2, or question 3. Would you please quickly scan over what our colleagues had to say here, and then using the heart button at the top of each conversation, so right here, would you please place a like next to the conversation that's speaking most to you? Whether it's an aha moment, whether it's something that's powerful to you, or whether it's something you strongly disagree with and you're wondering about, which of these 3 conversations speaks most to you? Please click the like button, the heart button, to show us that. Okay, well, it looks like we're starting to settle in there a moment. So here's where we're going to ask you to unmute for a moment, and we'll ask you to unmute in a specific order, so please listen for that. I first want to hear from the participant who appreciated question number 1, and that spoke to them. What was surprising? So please feel free to unmute yourself and tell us why that spoke to you. What did you connect with within that discussion? Okay. For those of you who did question number 2 discussion, that spoke to you, would you please unmute yourselves and tell us what spoke to you about that?
Hello?
Hello.
I think the thing that spoke to me was about this, what was not surprising is that I do notice people do that, like teachers that do those things, and that I've always kind of thought, well, why are we doing those things kind of thing? So I think that spoke to me that the students are recognizing that these things shouldn't be done, and that we as teachers still continue to do. Not all, but some teachers still continue to do those things. So I think that's what spoke to me the most about that.
Mm-hmm. Certainly, students have an innate sense for when we are with it, when we are on top of our game, and when we're not on top of our game, and when we have work that might not be as meaningful. And they know that, whether they tell us that in the classroom explicitly or by some of their behaviors when they're more checked in or checked out. They have a pretty good barometer of, they give us a pretty good barometer of how they're feeling about the work that we're giving them. So certainly the more meaningful we can make it is certainly helpful for them. What other thoughts are coming up for us around question 2? Why else did that speak to us? Or moving on to question 3, what spoke to us about the conversation over there? Why did that seem important for us?
For me, it spoke to me because I like to hear or reflect, I guess. I like to reflect on a lesson. And so when you ask yourself what thoughts and feelings are bubbling around your own practice, you're looking back on your lesson and seeing what you did right, what you did wrong, or not even wrong, but what could you do better? So that question really spoke to me.
Mm-hmm. The other conversation I see coming up in that session was someone asked how we gauge what is trivial or not, and Anissa said, well, there's the Goldilocks zone. There's something that's just right. When we think about the trivial, and we want to call back to, what that makes me think of is some of the sessions we did in the spring, and thinking about some of those more authentic learning tasks. So when students have a bigger picture to work toward, they know they're working toward this, writing this essay to solve this problem, or they're writing this letter to some public official to, because they want something done. Where they have an authentic context for that work, that gives it more inherent meaning, right? So when we have the opportunity to find those moments, to find ways to connect what we're asking them to do to the outside world, that's going to give it more meaning and reduce some of the trivial stuff we might want to do, or we might that students might perceive rather. So for example, if we're thinking about writing writing that letter, doing an outline in that context has a lot more weight and a lot more oomph behind it than doing an outline of a letter to a friend for a friendly letter at the high school level at least. Maybe at certainly at the elementary level, as we're a friendly letter to someone else is something is an authentic test for us, where we want to focus on some of those sorts of skills. So it's picking the right task and then finding out how we layer those, planning out how we layer those skills in there to make that practice most meaningful for kids. So thank you for thinking with us in Padlet. I did see one of you say that you loved the activity. We hoped you would. And we want to, where we have opportunities in these sessions, we'll include more opportunities like that to showcase different apps. But certainly we want to show one way it could be used so you have an opportunity to think about what it means for you as well. We want to think, before we go here, we want to think about a few different pointers for independent practice as you go forward, just as we have looked at some work in the field and what we've learned from some of the educators we've worked with over the past several weeks. And we see that there's 3 big types of independent practice that we can assign to kids. One of them is checks for understanding, and that can happen, as we mentioned earlier in the session, by completing simple problems or having students explain what they have done. So it's one thing to assign them 30 math problems, it's another thing to assign them 5 and explain the process that they went through to get that process done. And that really shows us what they know and what they're thinking about that particular skill. Another way to check for understanding might be journaling. So as we are working through an essay, taking a time out and do some metacognition. Why am I making these choices? Why am I organizing it in this way? Why am I leading with this argument as opposed to another one? And making that, think it really clear, really explicit to give as another way to give some independent practice and thinking at home. Certainly we could ask them to, also on the ELA side of things, we could ask them to identify literary devices. So what are some examples of metaphors or similes that I see within this writing as they're annotating and taking that check for understanding a little bit further. So if we know if they can underline a simile or a metaphor, they probably have a decent idea of what that is. And so that's one way we can check for understanding. A second type of independent practice gets a bad name from the drill and kill, but there's a reason that it's been an established part of practice for a while, right? And that some skills we need to drill them in order to be able to do them well. So for rote skills like times tables or multiplication or addition facts at the lower levels, at the upper levels, like kind of thinking about chugging and plugging formulas in math land. Those are important things to know to get a sense of how those number relationships and that number sense. That's not the only type of independent practice that our kids should do, but it is a type of independent practice we could prescribe to them. Related to that, though, is the idea of distributed practice versus mass practice. So mass practice is probably what I would wager that many of us on this call probably experienced in our elementary years, where our teacher would send us home with 45 multiplication problems, and we would have to go forth and do all of those and come back the next day and get 45 more, the next day and get 45 more. But after the first 10 of each of those, I knew whether or not I could do those things, and that's the same idea, right? That mass practice might not give a lot of benefit for the student or the teacher, because we have a pretty good sense in the first 5 or 10 whether or not the student is able to perform that skill. Distributed practice, though, is something to think about, especially to keep that multiplication analogy going. If we think about a few different practice opportunities, so we have 5 questions on my 5 times tables and 5 questions for my 6 times tables, and hopefully they don't overlap too much. That gives me a little bit of homework and a little bit of practice with my 5s while still moving on to the new skill with the 6s. And certainly we could tier our assignments in that way as well. Having a little bit of drill with a previously learned skill while also drilling a newly learned skill in these sessions here too. The last type of independent practice we might assign is processing, where we allow students to reflect on concepts. So it's kind of parallel to that journaling, but it's more of a, how does this fit into my overall scheme of things? We might ask students to come back with their own questions about that. So in a potentially easy homework assignment, once we have talked to kids about different thinking taxonomies. We could ask them to ask their own questions about the topic, either that they want to investigate or that they want to try and stump us with as they engage in some of that thinking. Processing homework or processing practice gives them opportunities to apply that skills or knowledge in a novel context. So if we have practiced our multiplication skills, you know, in the classroom and we're ready for that, so a processing application of that might be sending students home with 2 or 3 story problems to see how those multiplication skills work together. And certainly longer term projects can help serve us in processing as well as students try to integrate all of those skills. So as you think about your school year, whether you're serving in a leadership role or serving and thinking about professional learning, or whether you're serving in a teacher role and thinking about what your students are going to be doing this first few weeks, what types of practice are your students most likely to need to, or your learners most likely to need to demonstrate proficiency with those targets? So if you are an administrator, will your teachers need practice with using some of the apps and just that rote practice of here's how I create this online session for my kids to join to? If you're a teacher, depending on your first topics of the year, what types of practice, whether that's drill, whether that is processing or checking for understanding, what might your kids need? So take some time to do a brain dump. What types of practice will your learners need as you begin the year here? I'll give you another moment or so to get that thinking out. And it looks as though most of us on the call are serving in the role of supporting educators, not necessarily supporting students directly. So we're all thinking about technology, and so that's what these few exemplars show us, right? We're using Google Classroom, using recording lessons, implementing new resources. We need practice in those things. We need to practice using apps, not only on their own, but together to see how they work in synchron, you know, in the word starts with an S. To see how they work together and how they might synergize, there we go, how they might work and synergize with each other to deliver that learning experience for our kiddos. So yes, all those are things we might want to practice and support our folks with. So as we come up at the bottom of the hour, we are ready, sadly, to say goodbye to you fairly soon. As always, the feedback survey will pop up here as you leave. So we can also send you that feedback survey linked in our follow-up emails that we send for you as well. The feedback survey is how we track your attendance. It's the best evidence we have that you were here and you were an active participant, or if you're viewing a recording of this, that you viewed the recording and gave us some information about your learning. As part of that feedback survey, we will ask you for an exit ticket. Today's exit ticket is what other strategies might be helpful during guided practice and what situations might you use them in. You'll note that this one has a Pear Deck prompt because we have heard that sometimes it's difficult to transfer my thinking from what the exit ticket was over to the actual feedback survey. So the Pear Deck prompt, as you know, we'll share the session with you shortly after it concludes here today, so that thinking, you'll have that thinking on hand with you. With that said, I want to turn it over to Anissa for any parting shots she might have, and then open the floor to any questions and comments you might have before we say goodbye to you this afternoon.
No, thank you guys so much for being a part of this. I know this week has been a crazy week for everybody because we're either in the school or we're getting ready to be have kids next week. Independent practice is probably the one that is most similar But it really is going to be a good question in terms of what does homework look like when actually already at home for those of us who are virtual. So I think it really is a matter of how do we make that practice when it's on its own as really intentional and as meaningful as we can. So for those of you who are supporting teachers, it's really having that conversation and just think together about what does that look like. But we really appreciate you being here. We hope that we see you again at one of our other sessions. Next week, I believe, is closure. So we're finishing up the lesson cycle for this series, and we'll really be focusing on the metacognitive piece, on how do we get kids to do that deeper reflection. So going beyond the exit ticket, and how do we have them do some of that that more metacognitive type of closure to our lessons and to the learning. This is a plug for next week.
Indeed. So we will open up to the floor for you. We'll stick around, but if you must go because we are nearly at the end of our time together, please enjoy your afternoon. Otherwise, we're happy to talk with you as you might need to. And your copies of the presentation should be in your inboxes very shortly. So we'll see you soon.
And thank you, guys.